So over the last couple of lessons, we've been looking at the components of the liberal ideology. So we've looked at their view of existing order and how it was a critique of feudalism, being that feudalism has no social mobility, it thrives on the irrational, advocating religion as a tool for control over people, and it was a place of no individual freedom. So the position in which you are born is the position in which you'll die. You cannot question the government, you cannot question your superiors either. So liberalism was formed as the antithesis to feudalism and the medieval structures of society. So for a liberal, what they're hoping for a future society, their idealistic one, is that there should be equality, reason and enlightenment, and science is taken as the truth rather than religion, because science encourages questioning and so forth. Although important to pay attention to the fact that when we're talking about science and religion being in opposite to each other, that's more so regarding the Catholic faith. If you look at the Middle Ages and you look at the development of the Islamic Empire, their successes and their discoveries were a lot to do with the fact that they were a Muslim empire, and the Muslim faith really encouraged people to question and to learn, and it was a Muslim's duty to question things and learn and so forth. So that's just important to bear in mind, and I think you'll probably realise this, that the liberal ideology is very much a white ideology. It's very much a European ideology. So what was their version, or their theory, of political change? And that's what we're going to look at this lesson. So the liberal theory of political change. And there was a moment when there was an experience of political change fighting against the old notions of control, the old notions of power, and that was the English Civil War in 1642 to 51. And essentially what happened was King Charles I really believed in his God-given right to be King of England. He did not feel anybody had the right to question him. However, England has had a tradition of parliament, and that tradition has grown over sort of England's as part of England's nation, and essentially, because the Parliament had the right to raise taxes since the Magna Carta, what that essentially meant was that there was a constant clash between Parliament and the King. And the King felt that Parliament had no right to question him because he was put here on earth because of the divine right of kings. So this ends up erupting into a civil war when Charles I tries to go into Parliament and arrest 5 MPs and says, I'm going to arrest them because they have questioned me, they have broken the law and committed treason. However, the Speaker says, I do not serve you, sir, I serve the people, I serve the MPs, and I will not tell you where they are. And essentially it breaks out into people who were royalists, who wanted to defend the king and defend the king's right to arrest these MPs, to exercise control over Parliament, and they're the Cavaliers, and the Roundheads, the parliamentarians, who are fighting to have more freedom, fighting for those sort of liberal ideas that we've been seeing. So this is very early in the stages of liberalism, but it's this idea that you should have the right to question your power. So it essentially ends in the execution of Charles I. And then this is a moment for England to decide what is its theory of political change. They've just executed their king, now what do they do? So what will replace the old system of governance? Will they have a republic and have no king at all, and have Parliament exercising the control over the country? Or will it be a situation where they reinstate a new king? And then this is a moment of an interesting moment in history, because this is when they get to kind of decide what the future will look like. So by not having a king, is that going to create anarchy and chaos? By giving Parliament too much power, do they have the right to do that? Do they have the right of God, the divine right, in order to rule? So this creates quite an interesting moment in English history. And essentially, initially, it's decided to be a republic, almost, in the interim, and you have Oliver Cromwell, who acts more or less like a dictator. And it's seen in this period quite unsettled and a period of chaos and a period of anarchy. And this was the period where Thomas Hobbes was living in. So if you look at the date that he was born the same year as the Spanish Armada. And he essentially gets to witness these things that are going on inside England at this time. And he starts thinking and reflecting on this, and he talks about this idea of the state of nature. And in this, he's essentially highlighting all of the issues that he sees with life without rule, with with life without a king. And in it, he's essentially saying that the life of man will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, because every man will have strength to kill every man. It will be a place of continual war. And it will be continual war because essentially, in a state of nature, you can't trust anyone because there is nothing stopping them from killing you. And he essentially argues that humans are irrational, so he's not really a liberal. He's put as a conservative thinker. I don't even really know if he's that, but he was a royalist during the Civil War, though. And he essentially argues then that without rule, because men are bad, men will act badly. And he makes this argument that the state of nature, so life is solitary, so there is no communities because you can't rely or trust anyone. Brutish, because it's a place of violence and extreme violence, and he describes it quite a lot in his book Leviathan. And it's short as well because you can get killed at any moment. And even the weakest man has strength to kill the strongest because the weakest man can pay somebody to kill the strongest man and so forth. So essentially there's nothing to stop human beings from killing each other, and there's going to be no arts, there's going to be no society and no culture, because if you're thinking about things like trade and industry, which he also says there won't be any of, that relies on trust. Because if, let's say that you're building a house, you need to have windows, so you're going to have to ask a company to produce windows for you. So there's an element of good faith there that you're going to say, here's some money, I want those windows. And those people making those windows have to get from a glass supplier and so forth. So then there's another element of trust for the people making the windows. Now, if the window maker gave the glass supplier money in good faith, the glass supplier could just run off because there's nobody there to honour contracts and to make sure that people are doing as they're supposed to do and so forth. So essentially, it's a horrible place. And some people criticised Hobbes and said, you know, you're being really melodramatic. Human beings are kind, human beings are good. But he said, do you not lock your chest in your home? Do you not lock the doors to your house? You lock the chest in your home because you cannot trust your own family and your own servants, because obviously he's rich. But essentially, he's saying that even in our own homes, we don't trust the people that we live with. And you're saying that it's reasonable to trust people outside of your home? Definitely not. So he says it's a place of continual fear. And when you're in continual fear, the best thing to do is attack before somebody attacks you, essentially. So the state of nature is dangerous. So have a read of the extract from Runkman and think, what is it that has influenced Hobbes's view? So this is his solution to the state of nature then. So he talks about this idea of a Leviathan, and he talks about this idea of a social contract. So essentially what the social contract is it's an agreement, it's an imaginary agreement between the people of a country and their sovereign. And it's essentially saying that you will give up your unlimited freedom. Because in the state of nature, you have unlimited freedom. You can do what you want with no consequences. So he's saying that the citizens, or the subjects actually, he says, the subjects of a country should give up their sovereignty and give it to an all-powerful sovereign. And then what would happen is that person will be able to protect you from others. So if your neighbour wrongs you, you can ask your sovereign to essentially correct that. So people understand then that if they commit a crime, there will be consequences for that crime. And you can see here in this image, you've got, so it's an image of Charles I, which is obviously an interesting point that he's trying to raise here. You can see that inside the king, so it's not a very clear image, I apologise, but these are people. So the people make up the sovereign. The people make up the sovereign's powers. The other thing that you can recognise is the sword. So they have the power of justice. They have the power to execute justice. And an ecclesiastical imagery here on the right, which represents God and sort of that chosen God-given right. And you can see here the sovereign is looking over the people. He's looking over and protecting a village, and he essentially says, this solution to the state of nature, this Leviathan, which is a reference to a biblical creature, an all-powerful creature, and the Leviathan will protect you from each other, but you have no right to question him, because he's sacrificing a lot in order to protect you. It's a big weight on his shoulders. He's also in a state of nature with other monarchs, so he has to not only protect you from people inside your own country, but people outside too. So you give that Leviathan that power, you give the sovereign all your power, and because you've entered that contract, you can't go back on it. If you suddenly decide that you're unhappy with this deal that you've made, because maybe the king has come and taken some things from your house, like through taxation or something, you have no right to question, and you have no right to refuse, because he is the sovereign and you've given him that power. And this philosopher here, so Jose Ortega y Gasset, he says that law is born from despair of human nature. So it's this idea then, because we're so fearful of what we would be like when we're left alone, we're going to create law in order to protect us. I think it's an interesting argument, and I'm not sure that I really agree with this idea that if left alone we would kill each other, because I think that's quite a horrible thought. This idea that the only reason why we don't stab each other in our classrooms is because we're scared we're going to get into trouble. I think there's a lot more of a complex argument here, which obviously we can't have if we're not in a classroom, unfortunately. But essentially, it's a very negative view of human nature, and that's where it begins with liberals. This idea that humans are actually quite bad, but we can be rational enough to give up some of our power in order to cooperate and work together. So John Locke then looked at this idea of the state of nature, but heavily criticised that he created his own sort of solution to the social contract. So essentially, he too looks at the state of nature and he writes his own version of it. And for Locke, he doesn't actually believe the same as Hobbes in saying that we're just going to kill each other for the sake of it. Instead, what Locke argues is we are actually kind, we are actually altruistic, and we can work together in the state of nature. However, this breaks down when it comes to somebody committing a crime. So if somebody, for example, killed your brother, in the state of nature, because there's going to be no judges, there's going to be no umpire to see what's right and what's wrong. Because somebody's killed your brother, the only way that you're going to find justice if you kill is if you find you only feel better if you kill two of their brothers or something, and then essentially the punishment goes too far. And when people are seeking justice for themselves, because they can't be neutral, they're going to over-exaggerate the punishments and so forth. So essentially what he says is this is when society breaks down, when somebody is wronged. And when somebody is wronged, because they're vainglorious, they're going to essentially push to have greater justice than is actual justice. So he argues then, where there is no law, there is no freedom. So law is the thing that creates freedom, and that's because the law protects our basic rights. He also makes the arguments that absolute monarchs are but men, so moving away from this religious argument. And in that, what he's essentially saying is you can't give all of your power to one person. This person is not going to protect you because they are men. They are also vainglorious. They are also greedy. So you're just as at risk with one man having all the power as you are with all men having all of the power, because they're going to abuse that power. Hobbes would argue against that, and he would say, well, maybe absolute monarchs are but men, but you're safer against one man than against all men. And that was essentially Hobbes's argument. So yeah, he might abuse his power, but essentially that's fine because that's only one person who can harm you rather than all people around you, and you gave him your power, so you have no right to take it back. Whereas Locke is saying that's really dangerous, and the hands of the state can go very, very far because you can employ soldiers and they can create terror across the entire country rather than just being concentrated to one person. So essentially, Locke's answer then, his idea of the social contract, was that you could actually break the social contract. And that's because if you're sovereign, so with Hobbes, he's making it clear that the sovereign that he would like is a king. With Locke, his argument is maybe a king, but he would prefer a democratic country instead, so a parliament. And he's saying that if that parliament doesn't do what you wanted it to do, you have the right to remove it. So if that parliament violates your rights, then you have the right to get rid of that parliament. So he wouldn't call it human rights, so he would be referring to something called natural rights. So, and those natural rights to Locke are life, liberty, and property. So you have the right to your life, you have the right to your freedom, and you have the right to your things. And when you're talking about property, it's land, essentially. And you have the king has no rights to violate any of those things. So if your parliament or if your king threatens your life, you have the right to break the social contract, and you have the right to remove them. You have the right to remove your government. And he was critiqued for this and said, if you're going to have the right to remove your government, you're going to constantly just have new governments, and it's going to be chaos and anarchy all the same, because the government's going to create a law, you're going to be unhappy with that law, and then you're just going to have a revolution, and then it's chaos. But Locke made the argument that human beings are naturally quite cautious and naturally quite conservative. So even if we had an easy way in order to remove our king and our government, we wouldn't always take that, because it would be too much chaos, and we would prefer to kind of wait things out and be cautious and see how that goes. And essentially then, you have this issue that comes across all of this, which is this issue of power. And this issue of power is the liberal conundrum, because they realise that one person needs to have power in order to hold the state of nature at bay, or one group needs to have power. But at the same time, power is bad, because the more power you have, the more corrupt you become. And that's put quite well in Lord Acton's quote, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So essentially, any form of power you have will corrupt you. Even if it's a small little promotion at work, you're going to become less desirable, you're going to abuse that power. And the more power you have, the more corrupt you become as well. So it's about trying to reduce that amount of power, because if somebody has an absolute amount of power, they're going to definitely, according to liberals, use that to abuse people, and it's a bad thing. So this is a conundrum for liberals. A conundrum is a confusing and difficult problem or question. So it's an issue they're like, we know we need people to have power, but at the same time, power is actually a bad thing. So how do liberals solve this problem then? How do they solve the problem of power, the conundrum of power? So this is the role of the state. So what is the liberal vision, the liberal view of the role of the state? So the state is a nation or territory considered as an organised political community under one government. So the central point of this then for modern democracies is about consent, and it's about being representative as well. So Locke says the only role of the state is to protect life, liberty and property. So he's advocating for a limited government, a government to have as little power and as little role as possible. So essentially, it's created by a social contract. So the state is created by individuals, for individuals, and so serves their needs. So that's how we consent to it then. We consent to it, and we do this in a democracy every 5 years in the UK through an election. It's also the fact that we have the right to rebel. So we've consented, and we can remove our consent. We have the right to rebellion if government breaks contract, as it would be illegitimate. It's also a natural arbiter. So essentially, neutral. So it's like an umpire in a tennis match. Doesn't have any sides, doesn't side with any particular player, but she will always look at what's right. She'll look at all of the facts and decide what is right and wrong. There's a reason for, in football, where you can see that they won't have, when it's national teams playing, the referee will not be from the same country as either of the nation's teams, because it's about trying to remove bias as much as possible. So it's about being neutral, about making judgments and solving arguments. And it's about acting in the interests of all of its citizens as well. So another key thing is this idea of tolerance then. So if you look at liberals and where liberalism was born out of, it was born out of feudalism, a society where you weren't allowed to question, a society where you couldn't ask if God existed or not. And if you did, you would have been burnt at the stake. So a central theme in liberalism then is this idea of tolerance, and it's put very well here by Voltaire. So Voltaire was a French philosopher during the Enlightenment. He wrote a few books. One was a philosophical dictionary, which is quite interesting, and also a book called Candide, as well as other things. And he says this, he says, "I detest what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." So in other words, it doesn't matter if I disagree with what you're saying. It doesn't matter if I hate what you're saying. I will always defend it, because we have the right to free speech, is essentially what Voltaire is saying. And that right just needs to exist, and it doesn't matter if I disagree with it or not. So is this a great thing, right? This idea of free speech. So yes, because you can criticise, but how free should free speech be? Is it a good idea to have all of this tolerance? So yeah, good, because personal autonomy. It's good for self-development. So it's good because by questioning, by discussing, you can actually find out alternative arguments and perhaps change your mind as well. The government has no right to get involved in the private life of the individual, and that is referring to religion. So if you bear in mind, in the birth of liberalism, it was partly involved in the Enlightenment, and it's also about people being able to practice their own religions. So if you think about the Middle Ages in Portugal and Spain, you had the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisition, who went round and killed and burnt alive anybody who wasn't Catholic. So you had a lot of Jewish people in these areas who changed their names to try and hide and disguise who they were. You had them disguising the food that they ate to try and pretend that they were eating pork and so forth. So this was the situation in Europe. That's just one country I'm referring to, but essentially if you didn't follow your country's religion, then you would be killed for that. So Elizabeth I in England tried to act as if she believed in this idea when she said that she didn't want to paint windows into men's souls to see what their religions were. And yet she arrested and tortured people who didn't convert to the Church of England. So this was a time where you weren't allowed to practice your own faith. You had to follow the faith of the country. So when they're talking about this personal autonomy, that's what they're referring to it more than anything else. And it's also rules about how individuals should behave towards each other, about respecting what people are saying and listening to everybody too. So this is a belief in pluralism. So pluralism is about diversity or choice, and that political power should be diverse and widely dispersed as well. But that sounds great. Free speech is definitely a good thing. However, there are some issues with it. There's some limits. So Donald Trump, should he have had the right to say when the looting starts, the shooting starts? When Trump was saying this, he's advocating violence, and violence which will harm human beings, which is an issue. So people would argue that this is just you being offended, and if you're offended by that, that's not a reason to censor and restrict free speech. However, at the same time, it may just be words, but those words can lead to actions too. And just the language, these thugs and so forth, it was really a horrible moment. And Twitter did try to reduce this sort of content, but they decided to still keep it there. You just had to choose to look at it, which again is interesting that Twitter's taking those steps, but it's probably just not really enough. And the issue with the free speech argument was put really well by Renee Edo-Lodge, which is essentially where she's talking about freedom of speech in Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And she said this, she said, "The freedom of speech fight can hardly even be called a debate. Instead, it is a one-sided, with the powerful side constantly warping the terms of engagement. couching opposition to anti-racist speech and protest as a noble fight for freedom of speech is about protecting white people from being criticised, which is true. You see this a lot when Boris Johnson talked about Muslim women looking like letterboxes. He was championing free speech, according to a lot of liberal commentators. A lot of left-wing people too said that, well, it's free speech, he has the right to say that. But having free speech doesn't give you the right to be racist. And that's the issue with this. Free speech is often used to protect the views of racists and protect the points that they make. But these words that they say encourages racism in society. And then that does harm people. So according to liberals, when something harms somebody, you need to stop it from happening, right? And the role of the state is to protect you from harm. However, they argue that speech cannot harm you, so you should be free to say what you want. But the problem is that this speech empowers racists in order to harm ethnic minorities. So how is that not causing harm? How is it not causing harm when it's creating internalized racism too, and ruining people's hopes of being confident and fulfilling their roles in society and so forth? So this is kind of the limits of free speech. John Stuart Mill, though, was one of the biggest advocates of free speech, and he says this: if all mankind, minus one, were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So essentially what John Stuart Mill is arguing is that it doesn't matter what everybody thinks. It doesn't matter if the majority think one thing in particular, because it's actually really important that the minority voice is heard, because the whole of mankind could be following one really stupid rule. So in the context of when he was writing, they were following the rule that women shouldn't have the right to vote because women are irrational. And he was arguing that he should have the right to stand up and say women do have the right to vote. And that's actually something that he did do, saying women do have the right to vote. And he's saying that nobody would be justified in silencing him because that one individual could actually be right. And if you think about the voices in the abolition of the slave trade, they were a minority voice, things like the Quakers movement. So they should have the right to express what they're saying, because that's the only way that society can develop. That's the only way that society can improve. So truth can only emerge, according to John Stuart Mill, in the free marketplace of ideas, as good ideas can displace bad ones. So the free speech argument is extremely complicated. I wrote my dissertation on it for my undergraduate, so I wrote 10,000 words trying to explore this argument, and I still don't really have an answer to it. And essentially, the argument is the more you censor free speech, the more dangerous society becomes, and that's because it can lead to a slippery slope. So, for example, my dissertation topic was on pornography, and you have the issue where pornography definitely harms women. So it has been proven that pornography harms women. However, the argument is if you censor pornography, where do you stop? So a book was censored called Lady Chatterley's Lover, which wasn't really that pornographic. It just had a sex scene in it. And then that was a piece of art that was lost to the world, according to liberals. I mean, I've read it wasn't really that good. But essentially, if you start censoring swear words, does that mean that you censor art and so forth? So there's an issue that you can lead to a slippery slope where freedom is really violated through censoring free speech. So essentially, the government then is what Thomas Paine called a necessary evil. And he says that government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in the worst state, an intolerable one. So government is always bad, and that's because government has power, and when you have power, you will be corrupted. So essentially, we don't want to have a government, we don't want to have a state. However, we realise that in order to protect us from each other, we need to have a state, but it's one that should always be suspected. It's something that we should always keep our eye on and examine and scrutinize and hold to account, because we cannot trust it. So it's a necessary evil. It's something horrible that we have to have, but it's something that we need to keep a close eye on. So one of the ways that we try to have a limited government and constrain government as much as possible is, with liberals, a constitutional government. So it's about taming government. It's about reducing government's power through a constitutional democracy. So this could be a written constitution with strong legal restraints, and through the separation of powers. So preventing any individual from becoming too powerful. So if you have a look then, part of this would also include the protection of what they were calling at that time natural rights. So it's about protecting life, liberty and property as well. And the Bill of Rights are important because they actually define the relationship between the individual and the state, and how limited that state's power should be over that individual too. So the separation of powers then comes from this idea that power should be a check to power. So essentially, the reason why the American system is the way it is that it's split into three. So each three bodies, so the executive, the legislator, and the judiciary, are separated into three distinct bodies. So they can always hold each other to account, so that one person doesn't have unlimited free reign to do what they want to do. And because of that, it means that there's a restriction and a protection of human life and liberty. So, and if we look at the liberal democracy, it has actually been extremely successful. It has triumphed as the sort of most dominant idea across the world. And this is just a map to kind of show you the success. The green countries represent the liberal democracies. And what that essentially means is liberal, so it's checks and balances on the government to guarantee civil liberties. And democracy is that they are chosen, the representatives are elected and they are chosen. However, one of the issues and the limits to this, and it goes to the limits of free speech, and it also goes to the limits of a liberal democracy. With a democracy, a healthy democracy, all citizens over 18 can vote. Now, this is a picture from 2011, and it is in Colchester. And the thing on the right is a statue of the Second World War, the soldiers in the Second World War. And the people on the left, if you can see, are a neo-Nazi group doing a Nazi salute to what they believe is in solidarity with the soldiers who were killed by Nazis. So not much thought went into that then. But essentially, you have these groups who are arguing for nationalist virtues in society. They're arguing against immigration. They're arguing to keep Britain white. They're arguing to basically have a society which is similar to that the Nazis were advocating, which is incredibly dangerous. And Jose Ortega y Gasset argues this when he talks about the issue of democracy, and he talks about the issue of the mass man. So the mass man is born out of prosperity and industrialization, and he essentially says that because of democracy, because of the development of industrialization, you end up having it so that every single person can vote, and we live in a majority system. And they don't understand, it's a bit of a really negative interpretation, but an interesting one. They don't understand the nuts and bolts of society. They don't understand how it works. So one of the arguments about the success of the Leave campaign was that they manipulated facts and they outright lied. But the voters don't have the time to actually dedicate to check the facts of these campaigns and so forth. So they believe it, they just take it at face value. And then as a result, the country ends up making a decision which is going to be economically deprive them as a result, because there is going to be a period for certain where we are going to struggle because Britain has left the EU. And he essentially is saying that the issue of democracy is that every single person can vote. And because every single person can vote, it means that the wise, the smart people who can understand, are at the mercy of the bigger part of the population, the mass man, who's going to vote based on solely self-satisfaction. So when the mass man votes, they're going to vote based on just them. And because they're going to vote based on just them, society is never going to flourish, it's never going to benefit everybody. So yeah, he was writing during the Spanish Civil War, so he was writing in a very different context, and he essentially said that mass democracy has the means to overthrow civilized society, appealing to basic instincts of the masses. And he was writing about this because if you look at the success of Hitler in 1930s, he was, even though it was a minority victory, but he was voted in. And that's because people in the 1930s were desperate. People wanted a quick fix, and they wanted to essentially end all their problems. And Hitler gave them somebody to blame, who was the Jewish people. And he also gave them hope by making these really outrageous promises and so forth. So that's their basic instincts, having a car, having a roof over their heads and things like that. So it means that the civilized society is overthrown as a result of that. And he says quite interestingly, tell me to what you pay attention and I will tell you who you are. And that's how you can distinguish if you're a mass man or what he calls an excellent man. And the excellent man is the educated man, people with merit, people who have a desire to search for truth. So only these groups of people should have the right to vote. And that's an interesting argument, and it's a good counter to liberalism in the sense that the problem with democracy is that everybody can vote, and so forth, but it's not really a good one. But I'm just telling you about it because it's just something to think about, even if you disagree with it. So, and that's essentially because the issue of democracy is that it's the tyranny of the majority. And it's the tyranny of the majority because just one vote can change everything. So the democratic solution is recourse to numbers. The will of the majority always prevails. You can see this in the Welsh referendum in 1997. Such a tiny win, such a tiny majority, 0.3%, and it was still enough to create a Scottish Parliament, or a Welsh Assembly, and this created a Welsh Assembly as a result. So there's limits to that. You also had the same thing in Quebec, where you had an even smaller result as well. So there are limits to the idea that everybody has the right to vote. And John Stuart Mill tried to advocate for this idea of plural voting. So universal suffrage is conjoined with the possibility for some to claim and utilise multiple votes if they meet a particular set of qualifications. So according to Mill, wisdom is unequally distributed because of education. So just like Gassat was saying in the 20th century, the uneducated are more likely to act according to narrow class interests. Although that's interesting because, well, anyway, I could talk about it in a sec. The educated are able to use wisdom and experience for the good of others. So politicians should speak for themselves and the illiterate should be disenfranchised. Now, the issue with this is, one, especially when he's writing in the 19th century, if you are illiterate, that's because you're poor. So essentially, he's advocating to disenfranchise the poor because there's not proper schooling systems in order to give them the education they deserve. In terms of education, even today, education is, in terms of further education qualifications, a lot of people get degrees, which is excellent, but you have to have more money to be able to do a master's and even a ridiculous amount of money to be able to do a PhD. So this is essentially just about protecting his class interest in that sense. So if we were to have this system, what could you do to make it fair? How can you measure political wisdom? So it's not right plural voting, I don't agree with this. I can understand why it's something that people are advocating for or advocated for, but that's not quite a fair system. So what we have now in terms of universal suffrage doesn't really seem like it's working too well either. So what would be an equitable solution? That's an important question to think about. So essentially, to liberals then, their theory of political change is having democracy and having a limited government as well.